Ever experienced a difficult day and thought things couldn't possibly get worse? Well, medieval peasants would like a word with you. Back in the era when kings reigned and dragons populated folklore, ordinary people endured lives so arduous and demanding that your worst day might resemble a luxurious vacation. Because picture residing in a time when roughly 90% of the population lacked basic necessities we take for granted today. No electricity, no indoor plumbing, and certainly no option for takeout delivery when you're too fatigued to cook. It was just you, your family, and whatever provisions you could cultivate or trade for. These individuals were likely far more physically robust than any contemporary fitness enthusiast. While we meticulously record steps on our trackers, they engaged in an entirely natural, comprehensive physical regimen every single day, whether willingly or not. And rest assured, there was no protein shake awaiting them post-exertion. Yet despite experiencing what we would deem a considerably challenging existence, medieval peasants weren't idle in self-pity. They crafted their own forms of amusement, cultivated strong community bonds, and arguably enjoyed more robust social lives than some modern individuals whose evenings are spent scrolling through social media feeds. I mean, when was the last time your entire neighborhood convened for a communal feast? And no, ordering from the same delivery app doesn't count. Life was tough, but these individuals were remarkably resourceful. They had to be. When navigating a world devoid of convenience stores or online retail, one learns to make do with available resources. It was essentially extreme survival mode. But instead of lasting a few days as depicted in reality television, this was their entire existence. Now that we've established the demanding nature of medieval peasant life, let's delve into their actual labor. And indeed, they toiled extensively. The workday commenced before sunrise. In winter, this might mean rising around 7 a.m., but during summer, we're talking about 4 a.m. wake-up calls. Your morning alarm might seem harsh, but a medieval peasant's work schedule would render today's most demanding jobs leisurely by comparison. They weren't limited to a single profession. They had to simultaneously be farmers, carpenters, shepherds, and blacksmiths. You're familiar with the saying, jack of all trades? Well, these folks epitomized it, because if they didn't possess a skill, they had to acquire it rapidly or face hunger. The agricultural calendar dictated specific tasks to be performed with precise timing. Spring heralded plowing, and this wasn't about comfortably operating an air-conditioned tractor. 2 oxen would pull a heavy wooden plow, requiring the peasant to exert considerable strength to maintain a straight furrow at the proper depth. Fun fact, it took approximately 8 oxen to plow 1 acre of heavy soil in a single day. Losing an ox meant significant trouble, akin to losing your vehicle and your job concurrently. Summer presented its own set of difficulties. From sunrise to sunset, peasants were out in the fields weeding. A single patch of weeds could ruin an entire crop. However, medieval peasants actually pioneered many farming techniques still in use today. They understood crop rotation long before scientists could articulate its benefits. They would plant wheat one year, followed by barley, then leave the field fallow, empty, to allow the soil to recover. They were, in essence, the original agricultural scientists, albeit without the lab coats and clipboards. Fall was dedicated to the harvest, a period of intense activity. Every able-bodied person in the village participated, racing against time and weather to bring in the crops. They used sickles to cut the grain, essentially curved blades that required just the right swing to avoid inflicting more cuts than harvested wheat. Studies indicate that a skilled harvester could cut about an acre of wheat in a day, but this involved making approximately 15,000 individual cuts. Talk about repetitive strain injury. Archaeological findings show that most medieval peasants suffered from arthritis by their mid-30s. It's hardly surprising, as they were essentially engaged in strenuous physical labor from the age of 6. Winter wasn't exactly a period of idleness either. This season was dedicated to repairing tools, buildings, and fences that had deteriorated throughout the year. They also had to attend to the animals, which involved trudging through snow to provide food and clean their shelters. Furthermore, winter was prime time for indoor tasks such as spinning wool, making candles, and mending clothing. A medieval winter was essentially one long home improvement project, minus the helpful online tutorials. And let's not even discuss the pleasures of threshing grain indoors during winter. Imagine repeatedly beating wheat with a stick for hours in a poorly ventilated barn. It was like the world's worst drum circle. Interestingly, medieval peasants actually enjoyed more days off than most people do today. The church mandated numerous holy days when work was forbidden. Some historians estimate they had around 150 non-working days per year. The clever aspect of medieval labor was its communal nature. Everyone contributed during busy periods, and a complex system of mutual assistance developed. If your neighbor's ox died, you'd lend them yours, confident they'd reciprocate. It was an early form of social safety net, albeit involving more manure and less bureaucracy. Recent research into medieval village records indicates the remarkable effectiveness of these informal support networks. Villages that practiced strong cooperation were more likely to survive famines and economic hardships. And let's not forget the specialized skills many peasants acquired. Some became proficient in specific crafts like beekeeping, brewing, or blacksmithing. These were not merely hobbies, they were essential services that could determine whether one had enough to trade for necessities or went without. Estimates suggest a skilled medieval blacksmith could produce up to 100 nails in a day, a figure not particularly impressive until one considers that each was crafted by hand. After all this physically demanding labor, one might assume these individuals would at least enjoy a substantial meal. Well, about that. The average medieval peasant consumed around 2,000 to 3,000 calories daily. This sounds adequate until you realize they were essentially engaged in constant physical exertion from dawn till dusk. Bread constituted their primary food source. We're talking about 2 to 3 pounds of bread every single day. However, this was not your refined artisanal sourdough. Medieval bread often contained fragments of sand and grit from the millstones used to grind the grain. Over time, this actually wore down their teeth, a tangible reason to require a dentist. The most common beverage was something called small beer. It was a weak beer with low alcohol content that everyone, including children, drank instead of water. Why? Because water was often contaminated, and the brewing process made the beer safer to consume. That's right, in medieval times, beer was literally safer than water. Finally, a historical fact you can use to justify your drinking habits. The medieval diet adhered to a strict hierarchy. The finest cuts of meat were reserved for the nobles, while peasants received what remained, typically parts we discard today or feed to pets. They ate copious amounts of pottage, a thick soup made from peas, beans, and whatever vegetables were available. It was essentially the medieval version of throwing everything into a pot and hoping for the best. Sometimes it was so dense, you could stand your spoon in it. Medieval peasants would consume this pottage for days, sometimes weeks, adding new ingredients as they became available. It was like the world's longest-running leftover situation. During periods of relative prosperity, peasants might consume bacon or salt pork. Fresh meat was a rarity, perhaps available only a few times a year during festivals. Can you imagine saving up all year for a single decent piece of meat? It's like anticipating a major sale, except instead of acquiring a new television, you're hoping for a piece of chicken. When they did obtain meat, they utilized every part from snout to tail. They even had a saying, "You use everything but the squeal." It sounds like they invented the original zero-waste initiative. Remarkably, medieval peasants demonstrated considerable ingenuity in food preservation. They were compelled to, as one poor harvest could result in starvation. They developed effective techniques for smoking, salting, and fermenting food. They could preserve cabbage throughout winter by transforming it into sauerkraut. They dried peas and beans until they were rock hard. Literally, archaeologists sometimes discover these dried legumes and can still identify the species. Some of these preserved foods could last for years, making our contemporary fixation on expiration dates seem somewhat trivial. The church further complicated matters by designating certain days as fish days, during which meat consumption was prohibited. However, since most peasants resided far from the coast, their fish might include beaver tail or barnacle geese. Apparently, medieval religious authorities decided these counted as fish. One can only assume this required significant imagination and creative interpretation of facts about animal classification. There were actual scholarly debates about whether barnacle geese grew on trees. Spoiler alert, they don't. Speaking of religious influence on diet, the medieval calendar was replete with fasting days, up to 150 per year. On these days, only one meal was permitted, and animal products were often forbidden. However, medieval people devised clever workarounds. They made almond milk to replace dairy and created elaborate mock eggs from ground almonds and spices. They were essentially pioneering medieval vegan alternatives. Some of these recipes have survived, and modern food historians claim they are actually quite tasty, though perhaps not worth the effort of manually grinding hundreds of almonds. Analysis of medieval skeletal remains reveals that peasant children often experienced stunted growth for several years during famines. When food became available again, they would resume growing. Their bones literally chronicle periods of scarcity and abundance. Scientists can observe these growth interruptions in the bones, similar to tree rings. Recent studies suggest that medieval peasants were several inches shorter than contemporary individuals, largely attributable to childhood malnutrition and relentless physical labor. On the rare occasions when food was plentiful, medieval peasants truly knew how to celebrate. Harvest festivals could extend for days, with everyone in the village contributing whatever food they could spare. It was like a communal potluck dinner party, except everyone was profoundly grateful for the food. These feast days were infrequent bright spots in an otherwise challenging dietary existence. After a long day of work and consuming their pottage, let's discuss what these individuals called home. And trust me, it was far from luxurious housing material. In medieval times, the concept of home sweet home took on a profoundly different meaning. Have you ever heard someone complain about their one-bedroom apartment being too small? Medieval peasants would find that quite amusing. Their dwellings made modern tiny houses seem like opulent mansions. The typical peasant house measured around 400 square feet, smaller than most contemporary two-car garages. And incredibly, the entire family resided there, often sharing the space with their chickens and other small animals. Talk about an early version of a petting zoo. The construction methods for these houses were, to say the least, interesting. Most were built using a technique called wattle and daub. Wattle involved weaving together sticks like a giant basket, and daub was a mixture of mud, straw, and animal manure applied over the wattle. When it dried, it became surprisingly strong. Recent archaeological experiments have demonstrated that these walls could last up to 50 years if properly maintained. Not bad for mud and animal waste. And the best part, if a wall started to crumble, you could just apply more daub. It was like medieval spackle. Approximately 90% of peasant houses had dirt floors. Fresh rushes were spread on the floor, and herbs were added to improve the smell. These rushes would remain for months, accumulating food scraps, dirt, and who knows what else. When they became too unpleasant, a new layer was simply added on top. It was like having a compost pile right in your living room. Some archaeologists have discovered layers of medieval house floors up to 6 inches deep, each layer providing insights into the family's diet and lifestyle. The roof was typically thatched with straw, sometimes up to 2 feet thick. This was quite effective at keeping out rain, but also served as a favored habitat for rats, mice, and insects. Medieval peasants essentially had an entire ecosystem residing above their heads. Smoke from their fires had to escape through the thatch, as chimneys were a luxury most could not afford. This did, however, offer one benefit. The smoke helped preserve the thatch and deter some insects. Modern scientists have found that this smoke treatment actually created a natural insecticide that extended the thatch's lifespan. Windows? More like ventilation holes. Most peasant houses lacked glass windows, as glass was prohibitively expensive. Instead, they used wooden shutters or oiled parchment to keep out the weather. During winter, they would stuff the openings with straw or old clothing. Light was provided by rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat. These emitted about as much light as a birthday candle, meaning that after dark, retiring to bed was essentially the only option. Recent experiments by historians indicate that a typical medieval house at night had roughly 1/100th the light level of a modern home. Furniture was minimal. Most families owned a table, perhaps a few benches, and a chest for storing their limited possessions. Beds? Those were a luxury. Most people slept on straw-filled mattresses directly on the floor, and it got very cozy when everyone slept together for warmth. The entire family, plus any visitors, would huddle together during cold nights. Records from some manors show that even relatively well-off peasants might only own furniture valued at a few pence, equivalent to about $100 today. One of the most fascinating discoveries from archaeological excavations is the midden, a term for the medieval garbage dump. Every house had one, typically located just outside the door. Scientists have found everything from broken pottery to animal bones and lost coins in these middens. They serve as medieval time capsules, one archaeologist discovered a perfectly preserved pair of medieval wooden clogs in a midden, revealing that medieval footwear wasn't entirely different from some contemporary trendy shoes. Houses were usually built close together, fostering a strong sense of community. Most villages had a central green where animals could graze and children could play. Recent studies of village layouts indicate they were often designed to maximize sunlight exposure and minimize wind impact. These communities demonstrated considerable understanding of energy efficiency. Archaeological surveys have shown that many villages were constructed on slight slopes with carefully planned drainage channels to prevent flooding, medieval urban planning at its finest. However, living in such close proximity meant everyone was aware of everyone else's affairs. Privacy was not a medieval concept. You could likely overhear your neighbor's entire argument about whose turn it was to clean the communal pig pen. Speaking of shared facilities, many villages had communal baking ovens and animal pens. Contemporary court records are filled with amusing disputes between neighbors over everything from wandering chickens to overhanging tree branches. Some things truly never change. And let's discuss home maintenance. It was a perpetual task. Thatched roofs required regular repair, daub walls needed patching, and the issue of odor was constant. However, most repairs were communal events. When someone's roof needed fixing, the entire village would pitch in. It was like a medieval barn raising, complete with shared food and drink to celebrate the completion of the work. With houses being what they were, it's no wonder people spent so much time outdoors. But venturing outside meant navigating a completely different world of rules and laws. Regulations that would make today's most complex HOA agreement seem simple. The feudal system was more than just complex. It resembled a bizarre game of Simon Says, where Simon was your local lord, and failing to follow his directives could cost you far more than just being out. Let's start with the basics. Medieval peasants were essentially born into a mandatory subscription service they couldn't cancel. From birth, they owed their local lord a portion of everything they produced, and this wasn't a small share. Records show peasants had to surrender up to 50% of their crops to their lord. It was like having an incredibly demanding roommate who doesn't actually live with you, but still consumes half your food. Some manors even required peasants to give their lord the first loaf of bread baked. Talk about claiming the best slice for yourself. Contemporary court records provide some remarkable anecdotes. One peasant was fined for collecting an excessive amount of firewood. Apparently, staying too warm was prohibited. Another faced trouble for killing a rabbit on his own land, as all wild animals technically belonged to the lord. Even fish in streams were off limits. Medieval lords were akin to the child in school who declared ownership of everything. That's mine, and oh yes, that's definitely mine too. Speaking of regulations, peasants weren't free to relocate whenever they wished. They were literally tied to the land, a condition known as being bound to the soil. If you desired to leave your village, you required permission from your lord. Some medieval records indicate peasants had to pay a fee merely to marry someone from another village. Talk about an expensive dating scene. One record from 1293 shows a peasant compelled to pay his lord 2 chickens simply for permission to allow his daughter to marry someone from the adjacent village. The manor court was the venue for all local disputes. These were not formal modern courtrooms. Proceedings were often held outdoors or in the manor house's great hall. The lord or his steward presided over judgments on everything from property disagreements to minor offenses. One court record from 1320 details a man being fined for making excessive noise while brewing beer. Apparently, medieval noise complaints were already a concern. Another record shows someone fined for spreading gossip. Medieval defamation law in action. However, peasants did possess some legal entitlements, albeit quite basic. They could bring cases before the manor court, and records show they frequently won. Studies of medieval court records have found that approximately 40% of cases brought by peasants against their social superiors were successful, not insignificant for a system inherently favoring the powerful. Court records also reveal that women could and did bring cases to court, constituting about 15% of all plaintiffs in certain areas. The system of punishment was remarkably creative. Minor offenses might result in a fine, but more serious ones could lead to placement in the stocks, essentially a medieval form of public shaming. Imagine being confined in a wooden frame in the village square while your neighbors hurled rotten vegetables at you. Some villages even had a ducking stool for punishing troublesome individuals. It was like a medieval dunk tank, albeit considerably less enjoyable and typically reserved for women accused of being scolds. Archaeological evidence suggests some of these punishment devices were quite sophisticated in their construction. Village life came with its own set of unwritten rules. Everyone was expected to assist during harvest time, contribute during emergencies, and participate in community events. Recent studies of medieval village records indicate that those who regularly aided their neighbors were more likely to receive assistance themselves when needed, an early form of social credit scoring. One of the most peculiar aspects was the hue and cry system. If you witnessed a crime, you were legally obligated to start yelling and pursue the criminal. Everyone who heard you was required to join the chase. Court records reveal individuals were fined for not participating in these medieval flash mobs of justice. In one village record, a man was fined 2 pence, roughly $50 today, for failing to join a chase after hearing the hue and cry. Likely the most expensive missed workout ever. The most bizarre laws often involved animals. Speaking of questionable legal practices, it's probably timely to discuss medieval medicine and healthcare. And trust me, you'll wish you had today's healthcare system after hearing this. If you dislike visiting the doctor now, you would have found being sick in medieval times quite agreeable. Their medical knowledge was a strange blend of superstition, guesswork, and practices that sound like something from a Halloween prank gone wrong. Medieval doctors were quite fond of blood, specifically getting it out of you. Have a headache? Let's drain some blood. Stomach ache? More bloodletting. Stubbed your toe? You guessed it. Time to deploy the leeches. These doctors believed all illnesses stem from an excess of certain bodily fluids, and bloodletting was their preferred method for restoring balance. One medical text recommended removing up to 1.5 liters of blood at a time, equivalent to 3 blood donations at once. Records show some individuals underwent bloodletting monthly to maintain health. However, peasants rarely had access to these qualified doctors. Instead, they relied on local healers and herbalists. These individuals actually possessed considerable knowledge of plants. Recent studies have shown that approximately 80% of medieval herbal remedies had genuine medicinal properties. The other 20%, well, let's just say eating powdered albrain probably didn't cure your insomnia as claimed. One medieval medical book recommended curing baldness by rubbing your head with chicken poop, a treatment that thankfully didn't survive into modern times. Some of their cures were creative. Got a toothache? Try kissing a donkey. Yes, that was a real remedy. Headache? Tie a dead mole to your head. The truly amusing treatments involved wearing various animal parts around your neck, from dried frogs to fox teeth. It was like medieval jewelry, just grosser and smellier. A popular cure for rheumatism was carrying a potato in your pocket until it rotted. At least that one was relatively harmless. Archaeologists studying medieval bones have found that some peasants actually survived brain surgery. They've discovered skulls with perfectly round holes that had healed over, indicating the patient lived for years afterward. The success rate was around 80%, which is quite impressive considering they were essentially drilling holes in people's heads with hand tools. They called this procedure tree panning, and some individuals actually volunteered for it to treat headaches or epilepsy. When the Black Death struck in 1348, things became particularly grim. Doctors devised various bizarre protective measures, including distinctive beak-shaped masks filled with herbs. These resembled frightening bird costumes. But the herbs did offer some benefit, with some possessing natural antiseptic properties. Not that this helped much against the plague, but at least they smelled pleasant while fleeing from infected individuals. Some towns attempted to combat the plague by banishing cats, which unfortunately worsened the situation as rats multiplied without natural predators. Speaking of the plague, a popular treatment involved cutting open a live pigeon and strapping it to the patient's feet. The theory was the pigeon would draw out the disease. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, but it probably kept the patient in bed. Who would walk around with dead pigeons strapped to their feet? They held an unusually specific belief that red objects could cure fever. Some doctors would wrap patients in red blankets or make them gaze at red objects for hours. Archaeological evidence suggests some surgeons could amputate a limb in under 3 minutes. They even developed specialties. Some barber surgeons were known specifically for removing bladder stones, a procedure they could reportedly complete in under 2 minutes. But it wasn't all bad. They did have some intelligent ideas. Honey was used as an antiseptic on wounds, and it actually worked. Modern science has confirmed honey's natural antibacterial properties. They also applied moldy bread to infections, inadvertently discovering penicillin about 800 years before Alexander Fleming. Some healers even developed remarkable skill at setting broken bones. Archaeologists have found medieval skeletons with perfectly healed fractures. Despite all these challenges, medieval peasants were not significantly shorter-lived than people in ancient Rome. If one survived childhood, there was a reasonable chance of reaching 60 or 70. Perhaps there is something to be said for kissing donkeys after all. Studies of medieval burial sites show that about 10% of the adult population lived past 60. Not too shabby considering their medical care primarily consisted of bloodletting and strange animal parts.